Steel slid into the open one blade at a time, close enough to cut breath. Everyone expected shouting, blood, panic. Bumpy Johnson stayed still, and the room slowly realized the danger wasn't him. The room was never meant to feel comfortable. It sat behind a Harlem storefront, narrow enough that coats brushed when men shifted their weight. A single bulb hung low, humming faintly, casting shadows that refused to settle. This was a place chosen for endings. No one spoke when the first knife appeared. It wasn't drawn in anger. It slid into view slowly, deliberately, as if announcing itself. Then another. Then a third. Steel caught the light in thin flashes, close enough to feel heat, close enough to make breath feel loud. The men holding the knives stepped just far enough in to erase space without touching him. Everyone expected the same response. A surge. A shout. A sudden movement that turned pressure into chaos. Bumpy Johnson did nothing. He didn't step back. He didn't raise his hands. He didn't search faces for exits. He stood where he was, shoulders loose, eyes steady, as if the blades had appeared for someone else entirely. His stillness unsettled the room more than any threat could. The men with knives waited for him to fill the silence. Most men did. Fear usually rushed to explain itself. Bumpy let the pause stretch instead. Seconds gathered weight. The bulb continued its soft hum. Someone swallowed hard. This room had been chosen carefully. Close quarters were supposed to strip authority down to instinct. Proximity was meant to weaken restraint, make calm look like hesitation. That was the theory. It failed immediately. Because the moment knives appeared, the room stopped belonging to the men who brought them. It belonged to whoever could control what happened next. And control was not loud. It did not hurry. Bumpy Johnson understood something they didn't. Violence always waited for permission. And in this room, permission wasn't coming. The blade stayed raised. The silence held. And everyone present began to realize that the danger they planned had already been replaced by something heavier, inevitability. Harlem had never needed reminders of who kept it standing. Authority there did not arrive with sirens or speeches. It lived in routine. In memory. In the way people moved differently when balance was threatened. Bumpy Johnson built that balance slowly. He did not rule by presence alone. He ruled by what followed him. By the quiet certainty that disputes ended cleaner under his watch. By the understanding that chaos never lasted long enough to take root. Shopkeepers trusted him because problems dissolved before police ever noticed. Parents trusted him because streets stayed predictable. Men trusted him because lines were clear, and once drawn, they did not move. He never forced loyalty. That was the difference. Bumpy listened. He corrected privately. He forgave when forgiveness preserved order. And when it didn't, he did not pretend otherwise. People learned quickly that restraint was not weakness. It was calculation. That authority traveled ahead of him. Rooms changed when his name entered conversation. Not with fear, but with adjustment. Voices lowered. Jokes stopped. Decisions slowed. Men remembered past moments when stillness had settled situations that shouting never could. That was why no one in the back room rushed to intervene. The men with knives were not surrounded by Bumpy's soldiers. They were surrounded by Bumpy's standards. Everyone present understood the same unspoken rule: whatever happened next would echo beyond the room. Harlem worked like that. It didn't isolate moments. It connected them. Bumpy Johnson understood community as infrastructure. You protected it, and it protected you. Not loudly. Reliably. That was why he could walk without escort. Why he could sit without guarding his back. Why silence often arrived before danger did. The men holding knives misread this. They believed power lived in immediacy, in closeness, steel, pressure. They thought authority needed reinforcement in moments like these. But Harlem did not respond to force the way outsiders expected. It responded to alignment. To shared understanding. To memory. And memory favored Bumpy. Outside the room, the street remained steady. No running footsteps. No raised voices. Harlem trusted the pause. It trusted that noise would only weaken whatever lesson was forming. Inside, the silence deepened. Bumpy Johnson did not need to assert himself. His authority was already seated in the room, heavier than any blade. And as the seconds passed, that weight became impossible to ignore. The rival syndicate believed they understood pressure. They had built their reputation on it. Pressure was what they sent when they didn't want blood yet, but wanted obedience. And they believed Bumpy Johnson could be bent the same way. They chose men who knew how to hold a room without spilling into chaos. Not reckless. Not loud. Men who could step close, draw steel, and let fear finish the work. The message was supposed to be clean: we can reach you whenever we want. What they misjudged was the nature of the reach. They believed proximity erased history. That standing close enough stripped authority down to instinct. That silence meant hesitation. That stillness was indecision waiting to be exploited. They were wrong on every count. The syndicate's mistake wasn't the knives. It was timing. They assumed pressure worked best when applied suddenly, sharply, without warning. But pressure only mattered if the ground beneath it was uncertain. Harlem was not. Bumpy Johnson did not enter moments like this unprepared, even when he didn't plan them. His strength came from knowing exactly how far situations could go before they collapsed under their own weight. He trusted people to reveal themselves when given space. The men holding knives began to feel that space closing around them instead. They had expected reaction. A shift in stance. A tightening of shoulders. Something to answer their steel. But Bumpy offered nothing for them to push against. No anger. No defiance. Just calm attention. That calm worked like a mirror. Suddenly the knives felt exposed. The men became aware of how they looked, too close, too obvious, too loud without speaking. They felt eyes on them, not with fear, but evaluation. This was not a room waiting to erupt. It was a room waiting to judge. The syndicate had believed Bumpy Johnson ruled by reputation alone. They failed to understand that reputation was only the surface. Underneath it sat a system of memory, obligation, and restraint that did not react well to being rushed. Pressure shifted hands. What had been meant to weaken him began to narrow the men holding the blades. They realized violence here would not end the moment. It would open a larger one. One that would not be controlled by them. And control was what they feared losing most. This was the point where plans usually adjusted. Where someone recalculated. Where steel lowered slightly, not as surrender, but as instinct. The syndicate's miscalculation was complete when they understood this was not a test Bumpy needed to pass. It was one they had already failed. The knives stayed where they were, suspended in a narrow space between threat and consequence. No one counted the seconds, but everyone felt them stacking, heavy and slow. Time behaved differently in rooms like this. When violence was expected and denied, it stretched. Close quarters erased illusion. There was no room for performance now. No space for dramatic steps or sudden exits. Every breath sounded louder than it should have. A coat sleeve brushed a shoulder and no one moved away. Movement itself had become a statement, and no one wanted to be the first to make one. The men holding the knives felt it first. Steel had always worked for them before. It usually did. The appearance alone was enough to tilt a room. Fear rushed in to explain itself. Voices rose. Hands lifted. Control was taken quickly. Not here. Here, the silence did not crack. It pressed inward. It made the knives feel unnecessary, even inappropriate. The longer they hovered, the more exposed they became. Steel was supposed to shorten moments, not lengthen them. Bumpy Johnson stood exactly as he had from the beginning. Weight balanced. Shoulders loose. His eyes moved calmly from face to face, not searching for weakness, but acknowledging presence. He did not stare. He did not glare. He allowed the men to exist in the moment they had created. That allowance was unsettling. One of the men tightened his grip slightly, then loosened it again. The blade did not advance. The room noticed. Another man shifted his stance, adjusting a foot that had gone numb. Small movements, but they carried meaning now. The pressure had turned inward. Everyone present understood what this pause meant. It wasn't mercy. It wasn't indecision. It was assessment. Harlem's way of measuring whether a man deserved to leave unchanged. The light from the hanging bulb fractured along the blade edges, breaking into thin, uneven lines. Even the light refused to settle. The hum of electricity filled the silence, steady and indifferent. The man closest to Bumpy realized something he had not anticipated. There was no audience for his threat. No one flinched. No one stepped back. No one reached to stop him. The room had already chosen which presence mattered. He searched Bumpy's face for something, anger, tension, warning, and found none. That absence weighed heavier than any stare could have. It told him the outcome was no longer being negotiated. Bumpy Johnson did not speak yet. He didn't need to rush the moment. Pressure, when allowed to mature, always revealed intent. Anyone could threaten. Few could wait. The men with knives began to understand they were not cornering him. They were cornering themselves. Violence here would not restore control. It would fracture it. It would invite a response larger than the room, larger than the Syndicate intended. A response Harlem would not forget. That understanding passed silently between them. A blade dipped slightly, not enough to announce retreat, but enough to admit doubt. Another followed. Not surrender. Recognition. The silence thickened, then shifted. It no longer belonged to the knives. It belonged to Bumpy Johnson. And in that ownership, the room reached its breaking point, not with noise, but with acceptance. The moment had resolved itself without a single strike. Close quarters had done what steel could not. They had revealed who truly controlled what happened next. Bumpy Johnson finally spoke when the room was ready to hear him. His voice did not rise. It did not sharpen. It moved through the space the same way he always did, measured, steady, without asking for attention. And yet every ear leaned toward it instinctively. He didn't address the knives. He didn't acknowledge the threat. He spoke instead about rooms like this one. About conversations that ended cleanly. About men leaving able to return to their families without explaining scars. His words carried no warning, no promise of retaliation. They didn't need to. Everyone understood what he was offering. And what he was withholding. Bumpy Johnson knew something the Syndicate often forgot: dominance announced itself when it no longer needed to prove anything. He allowed the silence to sit between sentences, letting each pause do as much work as the words themselves. The men with knives listened without interruption. Not because they were afraid in that moment, but because they recognized finality when it arrived quietly. Violence could still happen, but it no longer belonged to them. The option had slipped out of their hands. Bumpy shifted his weight slightly, just enough to reclaim space without stepping forward. The movement was small, but the effect was unmistakable. The room adjusted around him, aligning without instruction. He spoke once more. Shorter this time. A closing, not an argument. The message was simple: whatever had been planned ended here. Whatever followed would not be negotiated with steel. It would be decided by memory, and memory was patient. The knives lowered fully then. One by one. Not in defeat, but in understanding. The men had arrived to test limits. They were leaving having found them. Bumpy did not watch the blades go away. He did not need confirmation. He trusted the moment had sealed itself. He had learned long ago that insisting on acknowledgement weakened authority. The silence returned, not tense now, but settled. The kind that followed resolution. Bumpy Johnson turned slightly, already finished with the encounter. He had no interest in humiliation. Stability mattered more. The men who stood there felt smaller, not because they had been threatened, but because they had been measured, and found unable to move the ground beneath him. Back in Harlem, life continued without ceremony. That was the point. No sirens announced resolution. No rumors spilled into the streets. Order had held, and because it held, everything else remained intact. Bumpy Johnson returned to routine. He listened to grievances. He settled disputes before they hardened. He protected balance without reminding anyone why it mattered. That quiet maintenance was his real work. People did not speak of knives afterward. They spoke of calm. Of how things stayed standing. Of how chaos always seemed to stop before it reached their doors. Years later, details blurred, as they always do. Some claimed the blades came closer. Others said they never mattered. Those arguments missed the point. What endured was the lesson. Power did not need to strike to be understood. Authority did not need to shout to be obeyed. Bumpy Johnson ruled not by reaction, but by control. And because of that, Harlem remained exactly what it was meant to be. If this moment meant something to you, don't let it end here. Subscribe. We tell the Bumpy Johnson stories that were buried on purpose. The quiet moments of power, the resistance no one wanted recorded. And the lessons our people passed down without applause. These stories weren't loud. But they lasted.